Honor Club, where honor is real.
What's up, wrestling fans? Welcome to episode 4 of Old School in Session. My name is Kevin Eck, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Ring of Honor Director of Operations and a former promoter and or executive for WCW, the NWA's Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Jim Crockett Promotions, and the AWA. He is the man who makes old school cool, Gary Juster. Gary, how are you, sir?
Well, Kevin, thank you. And I guess today we're going to talk about Ole Anderson, part of the Minnesota Wrecking Crew.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been looking forward to this one because, as I've told you in the past, I never met Ole. I've only heard the stories. I think most fans know Ole as one of the original Four Horsemen, but Ole actually had a long and storied career before becoming a Horseman in 1986. He was one half of one of the greatest tag teams of all time, as you alluded to, the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, with his kayfabe brother Gene. And Ole was really a major star in the Georgia territory and in the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas for many years. And he was also a major figure behind the scenes as a booker. But I think perhaps Ole, maybe even more so than being a Horseman, maybe is best known today as being one of the biggest curmudgeons, I think, in the business. As anyone who has seen any of his shoot interviews or read his book, they can certainly attest. But you knew Ole on a different level, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about. Ole was the booker in Georgia Championship Wrestling when you started promoting those shows in Baltimore. Do you recall your first meeting with Ole, and what were your first impressions of him?
I do. It started by telephone, of course, back then. I had gone through, as you know, kind of several different television shows, starting with Joe Blanchard's show, before finally ending up with Georgia Championship. But I had, as you know, been friendly with Vern Gagne, and Vern trained Ole. So I got some insight into Ole from Vern. And just as an aside, when Ole broke into the business after being trained with Vern, his name was Rock Rogowski. Wow. His real name is Alan Rogowski, and so he was, as he'll tell you, the original Rock. But and just as another quick aside, Ole's wife, Sue Crowder, went to the same high school that I did. Ole's from St. Paul, and his wife is from the suburb of Minneapolis, Golden Valley, where I grew up. And Gene Anderson was actually Gene Anderson. That was his shoot name. He was actually Eugene Anderson. The rest of the Andersons, of course, were kayfabe. And I'm sorry for my dog crying here to go out, but I'm not going to let him go outside. But anyway, so I met Ole by phone, and Ole was gruff, just as you suggest. But he was also very businesslike and very interested in coming to Baltimore. So we had a fairly cordial relationship from the start on the phone. But he was, like I say, he could be very gruff. When I met him in person, we actually had a few minor disagreements because not everything, there was no contract back then. Everything was I had a contract with the building, of course, but my deal with Ole was strictly on a handshake, very old school. And we had some disagreements, and I was brash myself in those days. I stood up to Ole, and I think he actually respected that, because from that point on, Ole and I always had a very civil relationship, for all the years that I knew him. Although I did witness much of his curmudgeonly behavior.
Did you use the fact that there was a connection there, that you went, you were from the same place that his wife was from? Was that like an in, or did that not faze Ole at all?
I didn't know that his wife was from the same suburb and high school until I got to know Ole later. But as I said, I had known Vern, as you know, because we discussed Vern pretty extensively in our last call, our last show. So Vern had spoken with Ole about me, And coming from, getting a recommendation from Vern, who trained Ole, and whom Ole really looked up to, was a real, big thing in my favor.
Okay. You mentioned that there were some disagreements and that you stood up to Ole. I'm just trying to picture that. Ole is such an intimidating presence. At least that's the way he comes across. Obviously, he's a bigger guy than you. He's gruff, as you said. He's intimidating. A lot of machismo there with Ole. Did you ever think that maybe that was the wrong thing to do, was to stand up to Ole? Or like you said, you were, I guess, kind of brash yourself. Was it just in your nature to not take any crap from anybody, even someone like Ole Anderson?
Well, I had the box office receipts. So it was it was, like I say, a minor disagreement as per the for the disbursement of those receipts.
Gotcha.
But we did work it out. But yeah, the building contract was in my name, and I first did the settlement with the building and had the box office receipts. So we worked it out fairly, I believe.
Okay. There's a famous clip. I know you know what I'm going to bring up. There's a famous clip that's gone around on YouTube of you and Ole. There aren't many clips of you out there, Gary. You've been pretty under the radar, I think, for the most part. But this is a great one. It was at the Baltimore Civic Center. I believe it was the second show ever of Georgia Championship Wrestling there. I think it was the night of Jack Briscoe and Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight title. And Ole is about to introduce you. He's got a microphone in his hand. He's sort of playing the role of I guess almost like a roving reporter. I think he interviewed some fans that night as well. And he gets ready to introduce you. And it's, well, here's the promoter from Baltimore. Gary, what the blank is his name? And then he broke up and you broke up. How often? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, several people sent that to me. And the funny thing was, I had forgotten that happened. Obviously, my memory was clearly refreshed by the video. That was pretty funny. Ole, I don't know if he had a momentary lapse in memory or if he was just being Ole.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Did he just like draw a blank on your name at that point, or was that a way of I don't know, rubbing, showing who's boss?
Yeah, I think he probably it was a legitimate forgetting of the name. We had a big house that night. I was a pretty popular guy at that time with the Georgia Championship Wrestling Group, because Baltimore, our first few houses were really good, and then of course there was the famous Black Saturday, and Georgia Championship Wrestling was no longer.
What did you think of Ole from a professional standpoint as a booker, or did you not get into that? I mean, I'm sure you had some kind of opinion.
I thought Ole was one of the really terrific old school bookers back in the day, in that kayfabe era. As we talked about earlier, the only wrestling fans had seen in the East Coast was WWF. Ole, of course, was booking, in a much different style. Flair and Jack Briscoe, was a match that was a very different type of match than one would see with the old WWF. So, and we drew real well in Baltimore, and I liked the show. I liked the show that they were producing. So, and of course, in the Crockett days, when Ole was booker, it was one of the real heydays in pro wrestling. So I think in that old school way, Ole was a great booker. When the business started changing, Ole was still old school. And as you know, old school and kind of evolution sometimes in wrestling just did not go together.
For sure. I wanted to ask you this about Ole and his assessment of talent. Ole was a very successful booker, as we've talked about, and made a lot of money in the territory era, in Georgia especially, and Mid-Atlantic as well. But, you know, we've heard him do these shoot interviews where he talks about how he thinks Ric Flair is just terrible. Hulk Hogan was terrible. He didn't want to book, you know, Hogan. He sent him on his way out of Georgia because he just wasn't any good. And I understand where Ole's coming from in a sense with Hogan. Ole liked the, you know, guys who could really go in the ring. Hogan was certainly not, you know, he was average at best as a worker. With Flair, it's a little more bizarre that Ole has been so critical of him, but I guess his main criticism is that Rick works the same type of style match over and over and over again and doesn't really vary it. But for someone who is as knowledgeable as Ole and was such a good booker, do you find it odd that, you know, two of the guys that are considered the greatest of all time, Rick, one of the best in-ring of all time, and Hogan, the biggest draw of all time, or certainly right in the top 2 or 3, that Ole didn't have any use for either one of them?
You know, it's funny, Kevin. Vern Gagne was of the opinion that unless you were really a great amateur or trained by him, so to speak, and he trained them in an amateur style in the beginning, that you really weren't worth anything. And it went back to Lou Thesz as well. As the business evolved, the styles changed, and you know, being a master craftsman in the ring was not really always a determining factor. And even going back to Vern in the AWA, guys like the Crusher in his later years and Mad Dog Vachon, they drew money with their interviews. Hulk Hogan drew huge money. Ric Flair drew huge money. I think you have to look at that as much of a barometer of success in the business as anything else, if not the most, important part. Because no matter how good you were in the ring, if you didn't draw money, it didn't matter. So to kind of knock those guys as, you know, 2 of the, the legends of the business, to me it just doesn't make any sense. Ole and I would obviously disagree on that.
Right, exactly. I wanted to ask you about the when Georgia Championship Wrestling, you mentioned it, Black Saturday, it was July of '84, I believe. It ended up with Georgia Championship Wrestling basically going away, and then Ole forming Championship Wrestling from Georgia and getting a slot. I believe he was on Saturday mornings, whereas Vince McMahon and the WWF had taken over the 6:05 Saturday night time slot. As a promoter at that point, what were your thoughts on that whole transition there?
Well, obviously I've been in touch with Ole and known of the purchase and of Ole's attempt to thwart it legally. They had, a couple of lawsuits, but as Vince prevailed, and everybody except for Ole and Ralph Freed, his partner, had sold their shares to Vince, and WWF took over. So we had 3 shows with Georgia Championship Wrestling. We had the February show, of course, the first one we talked about. We had the one that you just mentioned, Flair versus Briscoe. And then we had another one in June. And after that, when Ole formed Championship Wrestling from Georgia, we had a show in August and I believe in October. And then at some point, that's when Jim Crockett got involved. I can't remember exactly the date at which time he bought that hour back from Vince and controlled that hour on TBS. And then things evolved with us in Baltimore to the Crockett Gagne years and ultimately to the Crockett years.
Do you recall Ole thinking that, that they could still, the Championship Wrestling from Georgia, it wasn't quite from a talent standpoint. I think they had lost some talent and some different guys were brought in. It wasn't quite maybe the product that we were used to with the Georgia Championship Wrestling. Did you get a sense from Ole that they were going to ride the storm out, or did you get a sense that he was concerned that this could continue and that he would be able to continue. Because as you said, he did put all of his eggs in one basket. The way I've heard the story told is he could have gone and done like Jerry Briscoe and Jack, they did and sold their shares. And I think Ole told this story that Vince made him an offer and said, come with me, you'll make more money than you've ever made in this business. And apparently Ole's made a lot of money in the business, so that didn't really hold a lot of hold weight with him. But there's a story Ole tells where he basically told Vince McMahon to go F himself. And at one point he introduced Ole to his wife. This is my wife, Linda. And he said, yeah, well, she can go F herself too. Which do you think that actually happened, or is that Ole telling a story?
I'm certain that he said it to Vince. I'm hoping he didn't say it to Linda, who I always found to be a very nice person, actually. So I don't know, but knowing Ole, anything is possible. Ole was not one for social graces. Ole was not one to conform. Really, he lived in his own world. He lived when he was in Atlanta and married. He lived up in Woodstock, Georgia, which was probably about 45 minutes away from Atlanta. He used to tell me with great pride that he never gave Jim Barnett his phone number. Jim, of course, this was back in the days when Jim ran the office and Ole was the booker. And that he said it would frustrate Jim to no end, but he would not give him his phone number. And of course, this was well before cell phones. It was his home phone number. And that he would only see Ole when they had shows or when Ole chose to come into the office. But he said he rarely went into the office, and they just would meet at the shows once a month. Ole was also very proud of the fact that he spent very little money on himself or on anything else in his personal life. He drove the same car for long time, well before cars are as well made as they are now. He would drive cars for 150, 200,000 miles, and he would not very rarely buy any new clothes. One time he came up to me in Baltimore, this was early on, and asked me how I liked this coat that he was wearing, and the sleeves were too short. And I told him that, and he said, well, it was $5 at the Salvation Army. That was Ole. I always joke that his favorite two words are you buying?
And I'm guessing when he said that, you were.
Yes, until finally the last time I saw him at one of Greg Price's confabs in Charlotte, I insisted that he buy me lunch, which he did, and I was shocked.
Wow.
At the hotel where they were staying.
So Ole really did have a soft spot for you.
Yeah, he did. We always, like I say, we always got along well, even from the start. Even when we would have our differences, we always got along pretty well.
I think you told me once before you actually were invited to Ole's house, which you just told the story about him not wanting to give Jim Barnett his phone number, but yet you actually went to his house for dinner. Is that correct?
Yes, I was very friendly with Sharon Sydal, who was one of the vice presidents in WCW. She handled a lot of different things in her tenure. Very talented woman. She was in charge of international at one time. She was in charge of marketing, and she and Ole became an item, as they say, and they kayfabed everybody. And I kind of knew about it after a while, but I just kayfabed back. But once it was accepted, and I was invited to their home that they shared on Lake Hartwell in the north at the South Carolina and Georgia border, and it was a nice evening at their home. Ole is very private, but I'm one of the few people to ever be in his home other than his family.
Did you continue to keep in touch with Ole after you kind of went, different paths in the business? You spent some time together in WCW, I know, but then eventually Ole I guess, sort of, went into retirement and didn't really have any involvement in the business anymore. Did you ever happen to, was there a Christmas card or anything once a year, or did you keep in contact in any way?
I did not. In fact, the time that he bought me lunch, it was at that Hilton Hotel in, I think in Charlotte, or a suburb of Charlotte, where they would have that NWA get together.
Yeah.
And I saw Ole. He was, quote, holding court with some people in the lobby. And I went over, and he did not recognize me. And I wouldn't tell him who I was. And I finally left after about 20 minutes, and I wouldn't tell him. And I don't know who smartened him up, because when I came back a couple hours later, he then remembered who I was, and we chatted for a long time. And that's when I told him that he was going to buy me lunch, which he did. That's the last time I saw him or spoke with him, and that was probably in 2009 or 10.
Okay.
I believe. And so it's been a while. I know he's had health issues. I don't know. Like I say, I haven't spoken with him since then, so I don't have any updates. But Ole was a true legend in the wrestling business. Back in the day when he would work in the ring, it was much different than it is today. The guys wouldn't dream of going into the ring to work things out before a show. There was no way they would let any arena employee or anyone else ever see anything like that. And I remember being in the dressing room one night, and the guy Ole was working with just went up to him. I don't remember who it was, but he said, "What do you want to do tonight?" And Ole said, "Don't worry, kid. I'll call it in the ring." And that's truly old school.
Absolutely. And if anyone, I guess, epitomized old school, for better or worse, as we've said, because there's two sides to that coin. Certainly it was Ole. And again, I think this goes back to an earlier point that you brought up as to why maybe he considered someone like a Hulk Hogan not someone he would want to book, because, calling it in the ring, I don't know, maybe, Hulk was from that era. Maybe Hulk was comfortable with doing that, but certainly he wasn't going to be able to go in there and work a Jack Briscoe or a Dory Funk or a Vern Gagne style match. Probably all the guys that Ole, thought were the best, and were the best workers of the day. I wanted to ask you that, though, as a talent, what were your opinions of Ole? And before you answer that, I'll just say that, again, growing up in Baltimore, I didn't really see Ole Anderson. I only read about, the Andersons and the Apter mags, but of course, then through TBS, I got to see him and got to appreciate him. And then even as I got older, and I would, YouTube came out, and I could watch old clips of Georgia Championship Wrestling from the 70s and the early 80s. And for my money, Ole is actually underrated. As great as Ole is and as highly regarded as he is, I think he's actually underrated. He could have been, if he wanted to be, I think he could have been world champion. His promos were, to me, unbelievable. He could raise his voice at times, do the yell, but it wasn't the typical yelling and screaming that sometimes becomes a cliche. But he could also speak softly and look directly into the camera, and you believed every single word he was saying. He could literally talk you into the building. That's my impression of Ole. What were your impressions of Ole as a talent?
Very similar. The word I was going to use was believable. As you said, his interviews were very, very credible. He had a way of speaking that sounded authoritative and sincere. And whether he was a baby face or a heel, he had a way of reaching people emotionally. He was also a very good worker in the ring. By the time I saw him work in person, he was past his prime in terms of his body. He wasn't in the shape when he was Rock Rogowski or when he went to the Carolinas. He was already in his 40s, but he was still a very believable worker in the ring and of a believable character on the mic. So yeah, I thought he was a tremendous talent. I had only read about the success that he'd had in the Carolinas as part of the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. And then, as you know, they brought in a third Anderson, Lars Anderson.
Right.
And ironically enough, I mean, all three were Minnesotans, but then Arn, of course, the fourth one, was from Rome, Georgia, and had a Southern accent.
Right.
Sometimes Arn was a cousin, sometimes he was a brother. It kind of depended, I think, on which promotion it was and which announcer it was. But Lars was Larry Heinemi from St. Cloud, Minnesota, Ole from South St. Paul, and Gene from St. Paul.
Yeah, I'll never forget when cable TV first came around in my area and I first got to watch Georgia Championship Wrestling. One of the big angles was Lars had turned babyface, and they were promoting it first time ever at the Omni, brother versus brother, Lars versus Ole. And I was just, that blew me away. I'm like, wow, like brothers. Like it's one, okay, we've seen tag teams break up, best friends, but I'm like, these brothers are actually going to fight each other. This is unheard of. So and I wonder, that was probably Ole's angle. I mean, he probably booked that back in the day.
Very, very possibly. Yeah, very possibly.
His angles with Dusty Rhodes were so good. I mean, there was one memorable. I mean, obviously he and Dusty had a feud that went on for years, but there was one where Ole, after being a heel for so long in Georgia, finally turned babyface, and I think he was a babyface for about a year. And then there was a big angle where it was, I think, Ivan Koloff or the Assassins, one against Dusty in a cage. And Ole was going to be in Dusty's corner. He was the referee. I can't remember the specifics, but Ole turned on Dusty that night after being a face for about a year and convincing everyone that he had turned over a new leaf. And I'll never forget the promo that he cut after that, where he basically said for the past year, he was just building up to this one moment when Dusty would let his guard down. He's like, for the past year, I had to hang around with guys like Tommy Rich and Stan Hansen, who was a face. All these, it made me sick. And I couldn't even smarten up my friends like Ivan Koloff, because I just knew at one point Dusty would let his guard down and I'd get him. And I thought, my God, that's just, again, that was just, what an angle. I mean, Ole had convinced the people to like him. And just when they trusted him, he stabbed everybody in the back. I mean, it was just great storytelling. And again, the way Ole executed it with, the promos become key. The big angle is one thing, but then you have to follow it up with the great promo. And of course he did. And I'm sure that made a lot of money. And he also made a lot of money with Thunderbolt Patterson as opponents. And then right when you got involved in promoting Georgia Championship Wrestling, Thunderbolt had come back, and Ole and Thunderbolt were partners, which was, these old-time rivals had become partners. And then Ole turned on him, and he was planting seeds because Arn was back. Arn had come in at that point. I think they were actually calling him Ole's nephew at first.
Okay.
Yeah, and Uncle Ole was now a babyface again, and he didn't really approve of Arn, his nephew. I think he was being managed by Paul Ellering at that time.
Yeah.
About him. And he and Thunderbolt are these babyfaces, but more and more, Ole, his true colors started to come out, and he started to admire Arn, being aggressive and wrestling like an Anderson. And you could see that Ole was starting to have a change of heart. And at one point, Thunderbolt confronts him, and he's like, "Man, what's going on? It seems like you're changing." And Ole, during this one interview, just flipped the switch, and again, very believable, to where you could see him evolving from the guy that he was when it started to now becoming his old self again. And basically, he looked Thunderbolt in the eye and he said, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna touch you right now." And basically warned him, like, if you don't want me to touch you, you'll walk away. And again, I thought that was such a, to me, that's a money angle. And again, only Ole, well, not only Ole, other people could pull it off as well. But, the way Ole did it, he was masterful, I think.
Ole understood the psychology, as they say, in the wrestling business, as well as anybody in his era.
Yeah, I would say there's no question about that. But speaking of questions, let's get to a question this week, Gary, and it sort of comes on. Ole kind of plays into this indirectly. This question, surprise, surprise, comes from Gator. but it's a good question. And he says, which wrestler, from your standpoint, do you feel was the biggest missed opportunity to not win the NWA championship? Regardless of the reason, whether it was based on a career-ending injury, poor card placement, or not being a fit in the business due to personal/motivational issues, which talent that never became NWA champion were you most certain would draw money? I guess I'll just throw it out there. Again, I think Ole could have been the champion.
I'd say Ted DiBiase.
Okay.
When I first started watching Ted, obviously before he became, the $1 Million Man, but back when he was young, I thought he was a phenomenal worker in the ring. He could work babyface, he could work heel, he gave a good interview. And I thought maybe he was even being groomed at one point. I never really got into the politics of the NWA championship. And by the time I became an NWA member, the NWA was really in the process of dissolving, even though they might not have realized it at the time. But, Ric Flair, who was the last NWA champion, so to speak, of that era, became really a company champion for Jim Crockett Promotions, as opposed to an actual alliance of promoters. The alliance had pretty much broken up. So I thought that had it continued in its old school fashion, that Teddy was probably going to be groomed, possibly Magnum TA, had he not had the tragic auto accident. And another guy that I know people would laugh at when I say this, because he never really got the push that he deserved, but I thought he was a great worker and had a great personality. It just never came out, I guess, on television, and that's Brad Armstrong.
Oh, 100%. I agree with you 100% on Brad. I got to work with his brother, Brian James, Road Dogg, as people know him, I guess, best. We got to work together in WWE Creative, and I told him on several occasions that I thought Brad was just so underrated, and he agreed. He agreed. All the Armstrong boys wrestled, and Road Dogg was always very adamant that Brad was clearly the most talented of them. And, he was very self-deprecating. He would say, I could cut a good promo, but, I certainly couldn't go in the ring anything like Brad. And, I always thought that maybe if Brad had come around just a little bit earlier, he could have been a world champion. But he came in, I think he was a rookie in 82, won the Georgia National Championship, I think, in 83. And then he kind of, I don't know, he was always a good worker, had good matches, had a certain spot on the card, but was certainly not a main eventer. I know he got one shot against Flair in the Omni, which apparently was a great match.
And in Waldorf, Maryland.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
Oh, I figured you would have been at that show.
No, I did not go to the show in Waldorf.
We used to do shows on the Eastern Shore all the way out to Salisbury, but we also did spot shows in Waldorf and in Cambridge, Maryland.
Okay.
And there was a night in Waldorf, and we always filled the high school. They always did well. I think you could probably get about 1,200 people, 1,500 people in those bleachers. And we had Flair and Brad in the main event when Flair had the belt. Imagine that, the NWA championship being defended in Waldorf, Maryland.
Jeez.
But it was. And they had a hell of a match. It was great. Like I say, Brad was a phenomenal worker in the ring, and he and Flair just put on a real clinic that night.
Yeah, I wonder if wrestling hadn't gone national at that point, because, if the territories had stuck around the way they did, if Brad had stayed in Georgia, and we didn't have this national expansion, I could have seen him eventually maybe, being this big regional star, and maybe eventually getting a run with the title. But once it went national, and it seemed like, I don't know, Brad maybe just wasn't colorful enough. Although, his promos weren't bad, but I guess he just didn't have that over-the-top persona. So that once it did expand nationally. It just didn't translate for Brad. You know, you hear sometimes that, you know, a guy maybe is too Southern. I don't know if that was if Brad was a victim of that, but yeah, inside the ring, Brad was certainly one of the best I think that I had ever seen. A couple other guys I would just throw out there. Magnum TA, which obviously I think you mentioned. What about Barry Windham? I mean, I think there was a point where Windham, maybe in like 1986 to 88, you could make the case that he was the best wrestler in the business. Now, I don't know if his promos were up to world championship material, but I think Barry was as good as anybody too at that time. What do you think?
I agree. He was, and the guys all mentioned that too. Everyone loved working with Barry because he was that smooth and that good to work with in the ring. I don't recall his promos one way or the other, really. So perhaps they didn't make a real impact. But you could put someone with a manager if you had to. Someone like a Bobby Heenan or a Jim Cornette, someone to do someone's talking for them. But yeah, Barry was a phenomenal performer.
Absolutely. And when Barry turned heel, he did have that mouthpiece. He had J.J. Dillon, so I think they were a good combination.
Right.
You mentioned DiBiase being groomed for the title. I think another guy that, according to legend, that was being groomed was David Von Erich, and had he not passed away, he may have gotten a run with the title. Apparently, Fritz was influential, and obviously as a member of the NWA, and was campaigning hard. And David was really good. I mean, Kerry was the one who maybe looked the best on a poster or an 8x10, but David, I think, clearly was the best in the ring, and certainly would have made a fine NWA World Champion. Let me throw out two more old school names for you: Ray Stevens, Johnny Valentine.
I never knew Johnny Valentine. I saw him perform very, very few times. I saw him when I was a kid when he worked Minneapolis for Byrne, and he worked with Johnny Powers, and he worked with Crusher. I never really saw him much. I know of his legendary status. I've watched matches on YouTube. Johnny always used to use that cliche that others have used too. You may not believe wrestling is real, but I'll make you believe I'm real, or something to that effect.
Yep.
So yeah, I never really knew Johnny Valentine. Ray Stevens was a phenomenal performer and a legitimate, wild, tough, just I'll do anything for a thrill kind of guy.
Yeah.
Ray wrestled steers. Ray raced motorcycles. Ray was fearless, and he was one of the biggest draws in the history of the game. Almost anywhere he went, particularly in San Francisco. He and Pat Patterson were tag team champions, tag team partners. Then they worked against each other in a big feud. And there's at the old Cow Palace in San Francisco, in Daly City, California, the suburb. They have a wall in there, and the building still exists, and they have a wall that very famous people have signed. It's a real old building, and this is the second iteration of the building. They brought the wall from the first one to the second one, and they've got legendary signatures on there like Jack Benny and Bob Hope, Johnny Carson, and two wrestlers are on that wall. Their signatures: Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing as good as Ray was in the ring, and he was he would have been such a great bump-taking champion. He never got a run, whether it was the AWA, with the AWA world title, or the NWA, he wrestled all over in several territories. I wonder if it had something to do with the fact that maybe he was seen as too wild, as you said. He was a thrill seeker. Maybe the promoters thought that's not a guy they would want to put their world title on. I don't know. I don't know if that had anything to do.
I don't know if that's it. I think there are a lot of wrestlers who did not need to be champion, did not want to be champion. First of all, to be the NWA champion, you were going to work about 300 nights a year where they booked you all the time. And it was a lifestyle that was not for everybody. Ray, for example, loved working the Minnesota territory because in the summer, they basically had the summer off, and he liked being on the beach in a boat. I don't think Ray ever wanted that title.
Okay.
Roddy Piper, for example, certainly did not need a title to draw money.
No.
So there were Andre the Giant was an attraction. He didn't need a title to draw money. So I think it just depends on different people, on their personalities, on their desires, and then what in the old days with the NWA Championship, what the promoters wanted, and you had to fit that in, to the certain category of wrestlers who wanted that lifestyle.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure
there were other ways there were other lifestyles, other ways to make a good living in wrestling other than having that schedule.
Absolutely. And like you said, I mean, there's certainly, that could have been one of the factors. Who knows exactly why? Ray was certainly good enough. We know that. And as far as the style of the NWA champion, where you go from territory to territory and make the hometown challengers look good in defeat, they're not going to win the title, but they're going to look, they're going to win by losing, because they took the champion to the limit. Ray would have been, again, it seems like just a perfect candidate for that.
And another one who really, I think, could have been NWA champion and did not want it was Nick Bockwinkel.
Is that right? Nick had a chance to be I never knew that.
I don't know if he actually, quote, had the chance, but I know that Nick, for example, when Nick went to Minneapolis, I don't think it was expected he would stay for, what was it, like 15 years or so?
Yeah.
And he bought a home there, which Vern used to discourage people from buying homes because wrestlers came and went in territories. But Nick settled there, and Nick loved the lifestyle. He liked being able to go to Houston because Paul Bosch would recognize the AWA title. He liked to be able to go to Memphis, where Jerry Jarrett would recognize the AWA title. And he liked basically having the summers off because he had a boat and a wife that he was in love with until he died, his second wife, Darlene. And that's the lifestyle he wanted. He didn't want to be away from home 300 nights a year.
Yeah, well, yeah, it certainly was a commitment, no question. Well, Gary, before we wrap up, I did want to say I had one other quick thing about when you mentioned the Cow Palace. I did, when I was working for WCW as the magazine editor, I did go to one of the shows that we did at the Cow Palace. And, being a wrestling fan and a fan of wrestling history, and obviously, yeah, the building is certainly not it's nothing to look at. It's a dump now. Yeah, exactly. It was a dump, back 20 years ago. But it was like just to be in the building. I remember thinking like, wow, this is where Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson and, Peter Maivia and all these guys had these great matches. And I know that, that wall that you're talking about with the signatures. And I think that night, and you don't have to comment on this because I know you don't like to say anything negative, but I think that night WCW did some kind of gimmick match, and I don't remember what it was called. But anyway, I think Gary Coleman, if I'm correct, that night, it was one of the shows. I think it was in the Cow Palace. Gary Coleman from Different Strokes, little Arnold Drummond, somehow got involved, I think, in the main event and ended up taking a guitar shot from Jeff Jarrett, and I'm just thinking, wow, in the house that Ray Stevens built, this is what it's come to.
And if I'm not mistaken, WCW was no longer shortly after that.
I believe that is correct. All right. Well, that is all the time we have for today. It was a fascinating discussion. I love hearing the Ole Anderson stories. I love hearing the fact that there was a little bit of a softer side to Ole. Not much, but there was some, and that he did allow you in a sense, sort of in his inner circle somewhat. So I think that was it's great stuff. I don't think a lot of people can tell those types of stories as far as sitting down and breaking bread with Ole and gaining Ole's respect maybe by standing up to them. And it's good stuff. And that's what we do here on Old School in Session. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening. As a reminder, we have a new episode of Old School in Session every Wednesday here on ROH's YouTube channel. And if you would like to submit a question for Gary or a topic, you can do so just like Gator does by using the hashtag AskGary. on Twitter and also on ROH's Facebook page. For Gary Juster, this is Kevin and Gary's dog, and Old School is out. Until next week.
Are you watching the show that's thrilling critics and fans? ROH Pure. The reviews are in. It's completely different than anything else in pro wrestling. I enjoyed every minute of this show. ROH Pure delivers. Valiant Saint raves. Take my money. This was awesome. Join our ROH stars for the hashtag ROH Pure Watch Party every Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific.